Glen Campbell had played on more hit records than most people had heard in their entire lives. By 1968, he'd been the invisible hand behind dozens of American classics. His fingers had shaped the sound of a decade. Studio dates with Frank Sinatra, the Beach Boys, Elvis, Nat King Cole. He didn't chase fame in those years. He showed up, read the chart, played it perfectly, and went home. That was the job. That was the craft. And he was very good at it. In October of 1968, Campbell was writing something else entirely. Wichita Lineman had just been recorded. It would go on to be called one of the most perfectly constructed songs in American music. He was no longer just a session man. He was becoming a name, a face, a voice, and he knew it. It was a Tuesday evening when Jeff Beck walked into Western Recorders on Sunset Boulevard. Beck was 24 years old, freshly out of the Yardbirds and leading his own group now. The Jeff Beck Group had just released Truth, a raw, loud, deliberately unpolished album that didn't sound like anything else on American radio. Rod Stewart was singing on it. Ron Wood was on bass. It was the sound of something that hadn't been named yet. A mutual acquaintance, a producer who worked with both camps, had arranged the encounter. Nothing formal. Just come by, meet some people. The studio had wrapped its main session for the day. A few musicians were still around, packing up gear, drinking coffee, talking the way musicians do when the tape machine isn't rolling. Campbell was there. He'd come by to listen to a rough mix. He saw Beck walk in and sized him up the way a craftsman sizes up someone new. The jacket, the hair, the way Beck carried himself. A little loose, a little sideways, like someone who didn't quite understand why rooms had corners. Campbell had seen that type before. Young British kids with loud amplifiers and big ideas about what rock and roll was supposed to sound like. He nodded. Beck nodded back. Someone made introductions. Names were exchanged. There was coffee. And then someone mentioned the Truth album. Campbell had heard about it. He hadn't heard it, but he'd heard about it. What he'd heard wasn't entirely flattering, at least not from the people he ran with. Too raw. Technically sloppy, more noise than music. He set his coffee cup down slowly. "I've heard what you guys are doing," Campbell said. His voice was easy. No aggression in it, just the calm confidence of someone who'd spent years in rooms exactly like this one. "It's interesting, but I'll be honest with you, that's not really playing. That's feeling your way around in the dark and calling it art." The room didn't go quiet immediately. It took a second. Because it wasn't a shout, it wasn't a challenge thrown across a bar. It was something more uncomfortable than that. A professional assessment, delivered without malice, in a room full of professionals who all heard it. Beck didn't say anything. He pulled a chair from against the wall and sat down. He looked at a guitar that was sitting on a stand nearby. A Telecaster, somebody's, nobody in particular's. He reached over and picked it up without asking. Campbell watched him. The guitar wasn't plugged in. There was an amp a few feet away, cables on the floor, but Beck didn't reach for them. He just sat there with the guitar across his lap and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Nobody spoke. One of the engineers in the corner pretended to be busy with something. A session bassist near the door stopped moving toward it. Beck started playing, not loudly, not even through the amp. Just the dry, wooden sound of an electric guitar unplugged, barely filling the room. And yet somehow that was enough. The notes he chose, the space between them, the way he bent a string and let it fall back just slightly short of where it had started. It wasn't something you learned from a chart. It wasn't something you could read off a page. It lasted maybe 2 minutes. Campbell didn't move for most of it. He had his arms crossed early on, the way you stand when you're listening critically, when you're waiting to find the flaw. But somewhere in the middle of it, around the point where Beck played a phrase that seemed to resolve and then didn't, that seemed to go somewhere and then stayed, Campbell's arms came uncrossed. He didn't notice. When Beck stopped, he just put the guitar back on the stand. He didn't look around the room. He didn't look at Campbell. He reached for someone's cigarette pack on the table, realized it wasn't his, and put it back. The room was quiet in a way it hadn't been before. Not the polite quiet of people waiting for conversation to restart. Something else. Something that had weight to it. Campbell opened his mouth, then he closed it. He picked his coffee cup back up, looked at it, and set it down again without drinking. The session bassist near the door quietly put his bag back down. Later that night, driving back to his place in the hills, Campbell thought about a chord voicing Beck had used. He couldn't quite reconstruct it in his head. He ran his fingers on the steering wheel like frets, trying to find where the notes had been. He couldn't. He'd been playing guitar since he was 4 years old. He'd grown up in a house with 11 siblings and one guitar that got passed around like a shared meal. He'd learned to read music before he'd fully learned to read words. He could walk into any studio in Hollywood, pick up any chart, and play it down the first time like he'd rehearsed it for weeks. He couldn't find that chord, not because it was complicated. That was the thing. It wasn't complicated at all. It was something else. In the weeks that followed, Campbell found himself listening differently. Not to Beck's records specifically, though he did eventually put Truth on, but to everything. To the space between notes he'd always thought of as timing, but now thought might be something else. Something closer to intention. He didn't bring it up to anyone. That wasn't his way. There was one session, maybe 3 weeks after that evening, where Campbell was recording an acoustic track for a country arrangement. Simple stuff. A part he could have played in his sleep. The engineer noticed him stop mid-take, sit quietly for a beat longer than necessary, and then play the phrase again in a way that wasn't on the chart. Not wrong, not improvised. Just slightly different. Slightly more open. The engineer didn't say anything. He let it go and kept the tape rolling. That take made the record. But the producer who'd arranged the meeting noticed something. He'd known Campbell for years, worked dozens of sessions with him. He said later, much later, that after that October evening, something subtle shifted in the way Campbell played. Not in his technique. His technique remained immaculate. In the way he listened. In the pauses he chose to take. Glenn always played what was on the page, he said. After that night, he started playing what was between the lines, too. The official story of that evening was never written anywhere. There was no article, no photo, no tape rolling. Just the memory of a few people who were in the room, which meant the details changed depending on who was telling it and when. What stayed consistent across every version was one thing. Nobody remembered what Campbell said after Beck stopped playing, because he didn't say anything. In the early 1990s, a music journalist was interviewing Campbell for a piece about the Wrecking Crew. The conversation ranged widely. Session culture, the old Hollywood studios, what it felt like to be the invisible hand behind so many records. At some point, the journalist mentioned Jeff Beck's name, not in relation to that evening, just in passing, as part of a broader question about British rock's impact on American session culture. Campbell paused. There was a night, he said. He didn't finish the sentence right away. The journalist waited. There was a night in a studio, Campbell said, when I said something I shouldn't have said. Not mean. I wasn't trying to be mean. I had a way of thinking about playing, about what playing meant, and I said it out loud. He looked at his hands for a moment, and then he picked up a guitar. The journalist asked what happened. Campbell thought about it for a long moment. I realized I'd been very confident about something I didn't fully understand, he said. That's a specific feeling. It doesn't happen often. When it does, you remember it. He left it there. The journalist reading the room didn't push. Jeff Beck never talked about that evening publicly. That was consistent with everything else about him. He rarely explained himself, rarely pointed to moments, and said, this is where something changed. He played, and then he played again, and the playing was the only record he kept. But in a 1995 interview, when asked what he thought separated good guitarists from great ones, he gave an answer that didn't mention technique at all. The willingness to say something, he said, not to prove something, not to show you can, just having something to say and saying it. Most people spend their whole lives learning how to play. Very few of them figure out what they're trying to say. He moved on to another question before the interviewer could follow up. Western Recorders on Sunset Boulevard doesn't exist the way it did. The building changed hands, changed purpose, got absorbed into the slow architectural drift of the city. The room where that evening happened, the specific air in it, the particular way the light fell, the arrangement of chairs and equipment cases and coffee cups is gone. What Beck played that night is gone too. Nobody recorded it. 2 minutes of unplugged guitar on a Tuesday evening, went out into the room and then disappeared, the way music does when there's no tape rolling. What stayed was the effect. A man who'd spent 15 years building a worldview around craft and correctness drove home one night unable to reconstruct a chord. He searched for it on a steering wheel in the dark, all the way up into the hills. He never found it, and somewhere along the way he stopped looking. Not because he'd given up, but because he'd started to understand that maybe that was the point, that some things aren't meant to be reconstructed, that some moments leave their mark not by staying, but by changing the shape of everything that comes after. Glen Campbell went on to have one of the most celebrated careers in American music. He played thousands of concerts, recorded dozens of albums, won Grammy after Grammy. His technique never faltered. His instincts sharpened. He never again used the phrase, "that's not really playing." Not once. People who worked with him in later years noticed he had a particular habit in the studio. When a younger musician did something unexpected, something off-chart, something that didn't quite follow the rules, Campbell would stop. He'd listen carefully. He wouldn't say anything right away. He'd look at his hands first, then he'd nod. Nobody knew exactly where that habit came from, but the producer who'd been in that room on Sunset Boulevard in October 1968, the one who'd arranged the whole evening without knowing what it would become, said he had a pretty good idea. Glen walked in that night thinking he knew what playing meant, he said. He walked out still knowing how to play, but the definition had changed. He paused for a second. Jeff Beck did that without saying a single word.